Good
It should be
morning,
stopped, right?
everyone. Welcome back to the Carsey Policy Hour. The Carsey Policy Hour is the UNH Carsey School of Public Policy's monthly discussion series, engaging policymakers, public service professionals, and active citizens and organizations in the issues and policies that affect the Granite State. The presentation and slides will be available online this week. Our topic this month is lawsuits, courts, and executive authority. In his 1835 examination of democracy in America, de Tocqueville wrote, "There is hardly a political question in the United States which does not sooner or later turn into a judicial one." Less than 2 months into the second Trump administration, we have many political questions and many lawsuits. As these cases work their way through the judicial system, we look for the specific outcomes related to immigration or funding freezes, staff firings, regulations, treaties, DEI. We also watch for higher level decisions, precedents on legal decision-making itself. Who makes the laws, how the legality of those laws are determined, and how those decisions are enforced. The Constitution is our bedrock, but still open to interpretation. Today, Professor Daniel Pai of the UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law will explore the judiciary's evolving role in our constitutional framework and its power to check and constrain executive action. We're thrilled to have Professor Pai join us. He will discuss historical precedents that illuminate how individuals and courts' judicial philosophies may affect their opinions and how those dynamics play out today. Finally, we will consider current lawsuits, including those in New Hampshire courts, and how those contemporary cases fit into the broader story of checks and balances in American governance. Our series partners are the New Hampshire Municipal Association, the New England Municipal Sustainability Network, or NEMS, and New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training, with its Certified Public Manager program that feeds into Carsey's 4 master's programs. Please add your questions and comments into the chat throughout the presentation. We will have the chat open for comment and for viewing by everyone, as if we were all in the same room together. I will ask, in the spirit of an in-person discussion over morning coffee, please avoid inflammatory remarks and identify yourself in each remark if your Zoom ID is unclear. And we will enforce that as well, just to be sure that when we're participating in the discussion, we have a sense of who each other are. The Carsey School is independent and nonpartisan. Through our discussion series, we offer critical context and research-informed systems view of complex issues involving public policy. So without further ado, Professor Pai.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to share my slides, and hopefully this works. Does that look good?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about the powers that the president has and what limitations the Constitution imposes upon that power, and specifically the role that the courts have in limiting the powers of the president. This is sort of a general structural presentation on presidential powers. It's not specific to President Trump, although President Trump is very interesting from a constitutional perspective because he tests a lot of the limitations that have previously been established on executive power. So my presentation is going to be first to just talk generally about the separation of powers and constitutionally what limits are placed on the executive. Next, I'll talk about some of the recent executive actions which are potentially problematic to the established structure of the government, and then I'll offer some predictions and analyses of where I think broadly the challenges are going and what the likely outcomes are going to be. I want to preface that by saying that, of course, the law is not this objective thing that floats around in the ether. I mean, they used to think that in the 19th century, and there was a view called formalism, that there was some kind of legal truth. But I think most people at this point understand that what the law is whatever the court happens to say when the dispute comes before them. And so it's just a prediction of what the judges are going to say, and that's a little bit unpredictable. So, I could very well be wrong on all of them, but given looking at the past cases and the disposition of the current court, I'm going to make some kind of rough predictions about how the current controversies might go when challenged. Okay, so starting very, very at the level of utmost generality, what the Constitution does, at least the original articles of the Constitution, is to allocate the powers of government. And the concern, of course, is that the framers did not want the imperial British monarchy to take hold in the United States. And so they first designed a federalist system, which means that the federal government cooperates with state governments. So the states, what used to be the colonies, retain a great deal of their sovereignty, and so they have a lot of power. Almost all criminal laws are actually state laws. There aren't, there's no general homicide statute, for example, at the federal level. If you kill somebody, then you've broken the law in New York or New Hampshire or Massachusetts or wherever, but you probably have not broken any U.S. laws, any federal laws. So quite a lot of the law, contract law, tort law, criminal law, is in the states. And the idea originally was that the states would be the primary vehicles of government. And the federal government, they were fearful of the federal government because it was the biggest potentially, and they wanted to limit that. And so they divided the power into three branches, the legislative, executive, and judiciary. The legislative power was vested in Congress, so Congress gets to make the laws. And the president, the executive, enforces the laws or implements the laws. And then the courts kind of sit outside, and if there's a dispute, if there's a dispute between people about a contract or something, then of course they hear those kinds of things. But also, if there's a dispute between Congress and the president, or a dispute between an individual who says that Congress didn't have the power to make a law, or that the president is exceeding his authority in enforcing a law, then the courts decide those cases and controversies. But the courts have no spontaneous power of their own. All they do, the only power of the court is to decide the legality of issues through cases and controversies. So I drew the little Venn diagram there, and the point is to show that the powers of the president and Congress do overlap in some places. Congress sometimes creates these agencies, independent agencies, where the president appoints the person who runs the agency and has some say in directing how that agency ought to be run, but maybe doesn't have full control over that agency. And so we have this today. This was not envisioned probably by the framers, but we have a pretty large administrative state where we have this alphabet soup of independent agencies, which are kind of between Congress and the president. Some people complain that this is a fourth branch of government that the Constitution didn't authorize, but the authority is traceable to the text of the Constitution on some interpretations, and it is kind of a sharing of power between Congress and the president to create these agencies. And the other important thing about the Venn diagram is that everything that's not, all the powers that aren't allocated to Congress, the president, or the courts, all that leftover power goes to the states by default. So anything that the Constitution doesn't say that the federal government has the power to do, the assumption is by default that the states retain that power, which is quite a lot of stuff. And so it's important to understand that the ambiance, the mood of the Constitution that the framers were envisioning was one that limited the scope and size of the federal government. All right, so let's talk specifically about presidential powers. All the powers have to be traceable to some part of the Constitution's text. And it's Article 2 of the Constitution that talks about the president. And so we're first going to talk about what powers the president has, and then we'll talk about the limitations on those powers. So the sources of power are first the vesting clause. The vesting clause just says that there is a president. So that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. It seems simple, and it seems like it's not very exciting, but actually it does quite a lot of work. Because if you compare it to the vesting clause in Article 1 that gives the legislative power to Congress, that says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. And this doesn't say herein granted. It doesn't talk about the powers that are herein granted. It just says executive power, which implies something broader than congressional power. So whereas congressional power, the power to legislate, is limited to certain kinds of legislation, the executive power doesn't seem to have any kind of limitation. And so when the Supreme Court has scrutinized the text, they note that the vesting clause for Congress says all legislative powers herein granted, whereas the vesting clause for the president says the executive power shall be vested without any qualifications. So as we'll see, there is controversy in the extent of what the president's powers are supposed to be. And that subtle difference in wording people have made a lot out of that. All right, so that is one big source of it, because rather than the power vesting in an organization or a body like the House of Representatives or the Senate or the courts, this is also interesting because the executive power is vested in a person. A single person is a branch of government, right? So there's Congress with all the members of Congress and 538 members of Congress. And then you have the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but also the circuit courts and district courts. You have lots of people in those. And then you have the executive branch, which is just one person. It's the president. Okay. And then there's also the appointments clause. So this gives the president the power to appoint officers of the United States, as well as judges and ministers and stuff. But the important thing is that the president has the power to appoint officers of the United States, but it is with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so that becomes significant, as we'll see as well. But the appointments clause is another major source of presidential power because it implies that he has power over agencies, like the FTC or FDA or whatever. All right. And then the third major source of presidential power is the take care clause, which says that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that's very pregnant with possibilities. And the courts have made quite a lot out of that to say that the take care clause empowers the president to do quite a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily think just from reading that text. There are some, I'll quickly go through some other sources of presidential power from the constitutional text that are relevant here, but maybe less central. There's the treaty clause, which says that the president has the power to make treaties as long as 2/3 of the Senate agrees. Right, so he has the power to create treaties. Also, the president, as most people know, is the leader of the military. And there's also the impeachment clause that he has or not the impeachment clause. This is mislabeled. Or no. Yeah, there's a pardon clause. Okay, so it's that he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Impeachment clause is something different. It's mislabeled. All right. So there have been some historical cases where the extent of presidential powers has been challenged. People sometimes call these constitutional crises. It's not a legal term that has like a recognized definition, but the idea generally is a constitutional crisis occurs when it's unclear who has what power in the Constitution because somebody's pushing the limits of it. And the most important of these, and I've listed a few of them on the slide, the most important of these is the case Marbury v. Madison. And when I teach Constitutional Law 1, it's the first case that we consider. It is the foundational case. It's probably the most important constitutional case, and I'll briefly describe what's going on there. So prior to Marbury, it was really unclear what the role of the court was and what the extent of presidential power was. A lot of times people were just thinking by analogy, and by analogy, they just look at the king in England and they think, oh, the president is something like that. But we don't want it to be that exactly. And so it was really unclear how far things would go. The actual facts of the case are really quite trivial. Some guy, Marbury, was appointed to he was commissioned to to be a justice of the peace or something. Unimportant. He didn't even really want the position, but he was appointed by Adams, and then the administration changes. Adams loses the election, and so Jefferson is going to be president. Adams has already commissioned Marbury, so he has his position, but the commission has not been delivered. And so Jefferson says he doesn't like the Federalists, and so he says, well, I'm just not going to deliver it. Legally, at the moment that it's been signed and sealed by the Secretary of State, Marbury should have his commission. He is a justice of the peace. But physically, Jefferson just refuses to deliver the paper, right? And so Marbury sues and says, look, the courts, you have to make him do it. And so he goes to the Supreme Court and says, you have to do this. And he goes to the Supreme Court because Congress has passed this act, the Judiciary Act of 1789, which says that the Supreme Court can hear cases like this. Well, so the problem here is that they're facing the first constitutional crisis, because they know that Jefferson has told them, if you tell me that I have to deliver the commission, I won't do it. And if you try to make me, yeah, come and get me with what army, right? The president is the commander in chief of the army, so you can't do it. What does the court have? The court has nothing. They have like bailiffs or something. They have no power to compel the president to do anything. And the Chief Justice at the time, John Marshall, who ends up writing the opinion in Marbury, is cognizant of the fact that their branch of government has the least power. Congress has the power of the purse. They control the budget. The president has an army, and he's actually the guy who has control of government, really. And the court seems to have no power at all. And so what Marshall does in this case is recognizing that Jefferson is just ready to defy the court. He's just not going to do whatever the court says he's going to do. He says instead, we don't have jurisdiction to hear this case. We don't have jurisdiction. And then why does Marbury think they have jurisdiction? Is because Congress passed this Judiciary Act of 1789 saying, giving the courts the power to hear cases like this. And John Marshall says, no, the Constitution actually doesn't give Congress the power to give us the power to hear this case, to tell Jefferson what he's allowed to do or not do. And so what they did is they took the power of what was later called judicial review, right? So what Marbury is really about, a lot of students who read Marbury, they think it's a case about whether this guy gets a commission. Nobody cares about the commission. They think it's about whether the president has to follow the law. It's not really about that either. The case is actually about who has the power to say that Congress has the power to say that the court has the power to say that the president broke the law. So it's a super meta case. And the answer that they give to that is the courts. The courts get to say whether the Congress has the power to say that the court has the power to say that the president broke the law. And in this case, they say, yeah, we don't. Congress does not have the power to give us the power to tell the president what to do in this situation. And the smart thing about it, and if that sounds confusing, yeah, it's a bit confusing. It's very meta. But the maneuver that he's trying to do is Jefferson can't defy him now, right? Because what is he saying? He's saying, yeah, what Jefferson did probably is illegal, but we don't have jurisdiction to tell him that. And we're saying we don't have jurisdiction because we're the ultimate interpreters of the Constitution. And so Jefferson just shrugs his shoulders and says, okay, so I don't have to deliver it. And they say, that's right. And then they don't do anything for the next 50 years. They claim the power to be the ultimate interpreters of the Constitution. The Constitution says all sorts of stuff about impeachment and vesting, but what does it really mean? I mean, everybody has their own interpretation. So who gets the final say? The court in this case is saying we get the final say. And then they don't do anything. They don't use the final say for like 50 years. And then when they start to exercise their judicial power, they say, remember, we did that back then. Nobody objected. So we have the power to interpret. We're the ultimate interpreters of the Constitution. And everybody just kind of scratched their heads. Everybody who was, part of that controversy is dead now, right? And so 50 years later, they're like, oh, yeah, right. The court does decide what the Constitution means. And ever since that time, the court has been the check on the president and Congress when they try to overreach the powers that the Constitution assigns to them. And so that was the first sort of serious crisis. And that's also where the courts emerged as this final check on the abuse of power in the federal government. There were also other examples of situations in history where presidents either threatened to or were about to refuse to do what the court said. This is the worst nightmare of the courts. Right? The courts hate the idea that the executive will not listen to them, because ultimately they still are in the same situation they were in Marbury, that the courts actually don't have any army. They don't have any way of forcing things to happen. The only power the court has is that people voluntarily, the government voluntarily complies with what the court says. But there have been various periods in history where that was in doubt. And in those situations, the court has to tread carefully because if they push it too far and a president defies them, then it sort of reveals that the emperor has no clothes. Their power they become really disrobed. And so we'll see what happens. It seems like that Trump is particularly interested in testing those boundaries. It's interesting that we have as our Chief Justice John Roberts, who is a huge fan of John Marshall, and he cites Marbury in almost every opinion that he writes. And his judicial philosophy is one of strong institutionalism, which I'll get to shortly. Trump's main thematic arguments for where he gets his power are that he's saying that he has power over foreign policy and immigration pretty absolutely because he has the power to make treaties and that he's the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, and those things empower him to have broad discretion over matters involving foreign policy and immigration and war and things like that. The other thing that's significant is the unitary executive theory and the control he has over independent agencies and the administrative state. The unitary executive theory is an important theoretical construct in constitutional law. The idea is that all executive power is concentrated in the president, meaning that the president has to have direct control over all executive branch officials and agencies. And whereas this is coming from the vesting clause, that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, and also the take care clause, that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So the main claims of the unitary executive theory are that the president has absolute power to direct and remove agency heads and can't be constrained at all by Congress, even though Congress created these agencies. They are within the executive branch, and the president is the executive branch, so he can do whatever he likes. That there are no such things as independent agencies. What we call independent agencies is a misnomer. So regulatory bodies like the Federal Reserve, the FTC, and the SEC should not have any autonomy, that they have to be directly under presidential control at all times, according to the Constitution, and that the president has control over the execution of laws. So prosecutorial discretion is solely the remit of the president. And there are some key Supreme Court cases that support the unitary executive theory. In Myers v. United States, I think it was Woodrow Wilson wanted to fire an executive official. In that case, it was a postmaster without the approval of the Senate. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you don't need the Senate's approval to fire. You can just fire him. And then more recently, in 2020, there's SELA Law versus CFPB. And in that case, the court held that the president has to have removal power over independent agencies. So the CFPB had in their enabling act, they said that the president couldn't fire the director except for a cause. And Trump challenged it, and the court agreed that it was unconstitutional. So the alternative to the unitary executive theory is the balanced executive model. And the idea there is that the judiciary and Congress can impose checks on executive power by creating independent agencies. So some agencies operate without direct presidential control, like the Federal Reserve, and that Congress can restrict the president's ability to fire certain officials like FTC commissioners. And there are also cases that support this. So Humphrey's executor is, of course, the most famous case. In that case, the court held that the president can't fire officials from independent agencies at will. In that case, FDR tried to fire an FTC commissioner, and that violated a law that restricted removal to cases of inefficiency or neglect or malfeasance. And the court held in that case that Congress can limit the president's removal power for independent agencies as long as they have quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial functions. And the idea is that the agencies were not really created solely out of the executive, but that they have some lawmaking and some judicial functions. And so they're this sort of mutant amalgam of all three branches. And so the president can't have complete control since some of the powers that the agency has don't come from the president. Okay, so the reason why this matters, whether unitary executive theory or the balanced executive model are prevail, is because that determines quite a lot about what the extent of the president's powers are, because a lot of the disputes are about control over these independent agencies, whether you think they're independent or not. And the unitary executive theory is very persuasive to many Supreme Court justices. I would say 5 out of the 9 are sympathetic to unitary executive theory. All right, so the limits on presidential power come from, there's first congressional limits. So Congress has the power to legislate, so they can legislate away the presidential power. They can pass laws that say that the president doesn't have the power to do certain things, and limit the powers that they grant to the president in legislation. Also, if the power that the president gets is not from the Constitution, but from particular legislation, then since his power is coming from Congress, Congress can limit it however they want. They also have the power, of course, to impeach. And the president requires the Senate to make treaties and to appoint Supreme Court justices and stuff. So there are congressional limits. There's also judicial review, what I just talked about with Marbury v. Madison. Ultimately, the court is the interpreter of the Constitution, and the Constitution imposes a limit on what the president has the power to do. And so that's another check. There's also state sovereignty. So the idea from the Venn diagram earlier, any powers that aren't allocated to an executive branch are retained by the states. This is the 10th Amendment. And so the president can't violate state sovereignty. The states still have the power within their borders and within their remits, the so-called police powers. And then, of course, the president can't violate individual rights. So the president cannot do things that violate people's speech rights, for example. That would be a violation of the First Amendment. And so those are all limitations on the president's power. Even if you believe in a unitary executive, there are still these constitutional limits. So Congress imposes these limits. The judiciary imposes limits. The president can't touch things that are within the power of the states. And the president can't violate people's individual rights, which are the rights that are listed usually in the first 10 amendments. All right. So before we talk about the issues of the day, I should talk about how the court actually approaches the question when they are interpreting the parts of the Constitution that give the president power or limit the president's powers. So there is first the most persuasive to the present court is an interpretive theory called originalism, and the term has been politicized a lot, but at its root, originalism just means that you interpret text according to the original meaning, the meaning that the meaning of the person who drafted it, which is, I think, fairly uncontroversial. And Elena Kagan, one of the supposedly the liberal wing of the Supreme Court, in her confirmation hearing, she said, we're all originalists now, which I think is fairly uncontroversial. It depends on how originalism is practiced, but the idea that the text ought to be interpreted as it was intended is not a particularly controversial idea in itself. Within originalism, though, there are two kinds. There's original intent originalism, so you do some historical analysis or biographical analysis, try to figure out the person who wrote this, what did they mean when they wrote it? And then there's textualism, which is a different kind of originalism and is actually very strongly opposed to the original intention originalism. Textualism says you don't do any history. You don't look at the history. You don't that judges are terrible historians, right? Leave history to the historians, and judges just look at the text. And so the meaning of any ambiguous language in a statute or in the Constitution should be elucidated by looking in a dictionary. So you look at the plain public meaning that any person, not the person who wrote it, but just anybody living at the time, how are those words used at that time? Just look it up in a dictionary. And that is the view that was espoused by Antonin Scalia, and then later adopted by many of the other justices. Gorsuch and Thomas and Alito are all originalists. And so that interpretive mode carries a lot of weight. It tends to be associated with the conservative wing of the Supreme Court. But I think it's important to point out that there's nothing about textualism that is inherently conservative. One of the most, in rankings, some people usually rank him as like in the top 5 most liberal justices. Hugo Black was one of FDR's judges, and he was famously the first textualist judge, someone to actually embrace that label. And he was very, very liberal. So there's nothing necessarily political attached to the interpretive philosophy. And I think that most judges are more married to their interpretive philosophies than they are to politics, despite what newspaper headlines portray them as. There's also living constitutionalism, which is the idea that the interpretation of the Constitution should evolve as society evolves. Structuralism, that you interpret the Constitution with a view to the larger structural goals. So you don't focus too much on particular words, but you try to figure out what is the plan of the Constitution. What does it seem like the framers wanted the distribution of powers to be, and why, and how is this consistent with that? So it's this sort of bigger idea. There's institutionalism, which will be important because our current Chief Justice is an institutionalist. And that is mainly thinking about the court in terms of not partisan politics, but like internal to the federal government politics. And the idea that, the idea that the court should remain independent and powerful. And John Roberts is very much an institutionalist. That matters to him a lot more than politics or originalism or any of these other things. He wants the court to be powerful and healthy and to be able to continue to have the power of judicial review. This was also, Chief Justice Marshall's sort of interpretive bent was institutionalism. So it's this sort of strategic positioning of the court to maintain its power despite the lack of an army. And the last is kind of a catch-all, but it's tough to define. But pragmatism is some combination of all of these things that tries to, in some way, maximize people's social welfare. All right, so these are the main things. Everybody is a bit of a structuralist, and everybody's a bit of a pragmatist these days. So the main ways to divide these are who's more aligned with originalism, structuralism, living constitutionalism, or institutionalism. And broadly, the current composition of the court, you could divide them this way. So the originalist textualists are Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett. And they are strongly associated with a politically conservative wing of the party, but they are very committed to textualism and originalism. Barrett less so, but the other three seem to be fairly strongly committed to that. Living constitutionalism is kind of more represented by the liberal or left wing of the court, which is Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. And so those people are more open to the idea that the meaning of the Constitution can change over time. And then I think that it would be fair to say that the institutionalists are probably Roberts and Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh has not been on the court that long, and so we're still kind of feeling out where he lands. But Roberts very clearly is an institutionalist. He cares not about Republican ideals or Democratic ideals or anything really other than that the court must remain neutral and supreme. All right, so that's the court that we're looking at, and what they're going to do is they're going to exercise judicial review to hopefully constrain the president when he oversteps his power, and to also call it when the president does have the power to do things. So here are I'll just talk about, run through the current sort of controversies that are happening that test executive authority. So on national security and foreign policy, first, President Trump has said that he wants to withdraw from the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement. And the authority that he claims to do this is the vesting clause, that he is the executive and that it is within the ambit of the powers of the executive to say what executive agreements we enter into. And so he can just exit that. And that's pretty uncontroversial. There's not a good counter to that. It would be difficult to challenge his authority to withdraw from the WHO and Paris, because that was never a treaty in the first place. And so there's no argument that the Senate or the Congress would have to be involved in withdrawal from that. More complicated, however, is his saying that he wants to withdraw from NATO. Now, that is a treaty obligation. And so he's going to make a structural argument in saying that the power to make treaties which he has, implies that he has the power to unmake treaties as well. Of course, the counter argument to that is the president doesn't have unilateral power to make treaties. He requires Senate approval, right? Therefore, the power to end treaties also ought to involve Senate approval. And so this is a fraught issue. Now, there have been previous Supreme Court cases on this, Goldwater v. Carter in 1979. In that case, Jimmy Carter wanted to get out of the treaty with Taiwan. And the court was faced with the question, does he require Senate approval to exit a treaty? And they kind of dodged the question. They said they didn't have jurisdiction because it was a political question. And if that's right, they would always dodge the question. It's not just they're dodging that particular question, but they would dodge the question whenever it came up, whether or not the president requires Senate approval to exit a treaty. If they do the same thing now, then that essentially means by default that the president does have the power to unilaterally exit a treaty. The other thing in national security and foreign policy, which may be problematic, is that President Trump wants to designate foreign drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. That does several things. It grants him the power to use the military and intelligence agencies against the foreign drug cartels, and so he can do some operations in Mexico or Guatemala or wherever they're coming from. So the power that he claims to have to do this is the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act from 1996. And that is probably not something that can be challenged. It's not, his power is not coming from the Constitution. He doesn't have the inherent power to do that, but he was given the power to do that by Congress with this legislation. So that he probably does have the power to designate foreign drug cartels as FTOs. The caveat there is that since the power comes from Congress, Congress can repeal the act or remove authorization. So there is a strong check on that. Now, whether this particular Congress would check the president in this way, I would be doubtful. But that is the check because the power is not coming from the Constitution. All right. On immigration, there's a whole lot of stuff that's been happening. So Trump has issued by executive order, he's tried to end birthright citizenship. And he's claiming that his authority to do this is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and the 14th Amendment. And specifically, he's saying that the 14th Amendment, which says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And he's saying that and subject to the jurisdiction thereof means that it excludes people who are here illegally. And so if a person is born in the United States, within the United States territory, to illegal immigrants, then they are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and therefore they are not citizens. The problem, of course, the counter is that the 14th Amendment has already been interpreted in Wong Kim Ark to mean that anybody who's born or naturalized, including somebody whose parents are here illegally, is still a citizen of the United States. And that is fairly well settled precedent. And because of Marbury v. Madison, it is the court that has the ultimate power to interpret the Constitution, not the president. So even if Trump reads subject to the jurisdiction thereof to exclude people who are the children of illegal immigrants, the court doesn't read it that way. And Marbury v. Madison established that the court is the definitive interpreter of the Constitution. So with asylum suspension, there's also the authority comes from congressional legislation, and there may be due process considerations. The freeze on refugee admissions, this is, he has the power from, again, a legislative act, but this may contradict a treaty obligation. And he's declaring a national emergency on the southern border. That, again, comes from legislation. But depending on what he wants to do with that, it may violate the appropriations clause if he's trying to reallocate money that Congress has appropriated elsewhere. And the expansion of mass deportations, again, he probably has the authority to do that under legislation, but if the way he does it is in some way violative of the immigrants' rights, then that's a due process violation. On culture war issues, He's using the vesting clause and the take care clause to determine what happens within the executive branch using the unitary executive theory. And so, yeah, he's going to use that to try to eliminate DIA programs within the government. He can also try to control funding, grants and stuff to eliminate DEI outside of the government. Both of those are primarily using the take care clause and the vesting clause. And defining sex in terms of biological sex at birth, again, is using the take care clause and the absence of congressional commentary on the matter. That, of course, runs into constitutional problems because of equal protection. And cutting funding to healthcare providers who offer gender-affirming care, again, he's going to claim has the power to do that under the vesting clause because the funding goes through the executive department and he's in charge of the executive department. All right, there's also the education stuff. There's broadly for deregulation, he's also claiming this is internal to the executive department, and so he can do whatever he wants. In terms of making the independent administrative agencies accountable to the president, he's going to assert the unitary executive theory. And the establishment of DOGE, again, he's just going to say he can organize his own department however he wants, since the president is the executive department. The problem, of course, is that you need to fund it, and Congress has the power of the purse. On freezing federal funds, he's going to say that this is the take care clause. If he's allocated funds, it's up to his discretion how to use them. But of course, there is legislation that says that the president cannot actually do that. All right, and we've already talked about Paris Climate Accords, and yeah, there's other environmental stuff that has to be executed through the EPA, which is an executive agency, and so he's going to claim that the vesting clause and take care clause give him the power to do that. All right. Well, there's other issues as well. Okay. So briefly on predictions, I just made a table about where Trump, the way to think about this is in terms of where is Trump getting the authority that he claims, and what are the limits? What are the reasons why he might not have that power? I don't claim that there's an easy answer to a lot of these questions. Whenever Trump does anything, he's going to claim, or whenever any president does anything, they're going to claim to have a certain kind of power. And then people who oppose what the president is doing is going to say, well, that's unconstitutional, or the president doesn't have the power to do that for some reason. And so I've tried to list in the columns where the president is going to claim they get the power and where his opponents are going to claim the limitation comes from. And I kind of eyeballed what I think is the risk. Constitutional risk means the risk to Trump that what he's doing is unconstitutional. And that the counter argument is likely to prevail. So I have 2 slides on that. That's just going through what I've talked about previously, but kind of aggregated into one place. All right. Well, so sorry if I mistimed that a little bit, but I'm happy to take questions.
Not at all. And you can go ahead, I think, and turn the slide off, Professor
Sure.
Pai. That was incredible. And we did get an audience member pushing back, but this is the good stuff. And it is. And I wish we had more time and we could spend an hour. Oh, excuse me, my video is off. We could spend an hour on any of these. I hope that folks will go through that with the high level descriptions of the counter of the argument and the counter that you've made, and understand more what the administration's point is and what the plaintiff's points are. I'll note also that we have a fantastic audience here today. Oh my goodness, across issue areas, organizations, and roles. So thanks to all of you for for being here today, for caring, for paying attention. Many of the questions are about compliance, right? And we know that in Marbury versus Madison, the court dodged the question. Do you anticipate any dodges with the current lawsuits? If so, which ones and why? This is sort of a 3-part. If the president chooses to defy the court's ruling, what institutional protections are there, or what institutional recourse? And then finally, a question from Bill Maddox. What is the most effective recourse the people would have to take action against the president based on historical precedents? So a dodge in the first place, a ruling that is not complied with, and institutional protections, if any, and going beyond that to the people.
Okay, great. Yeah. So on the first question, whether the court is likely to dodge, this is a very good question. I think that's actually the right question. People are very fixed on whether the court is going to say yes or no. They often forget to think that the court can always dodge. And I think there's a very high likelihood that on some of the major questions, the court will dodge. I think it's important to point out that in Marbury, they dodged, but they also did say that what Jefferson was doing was illegal. They said, it's illegal. We just don't have the power to stop you. So it's a very interesting dodge. I think that it's likely that that will happen because Roberts, like Marshall, is very aware that the legitimacy of the court is on the line here. And the worst thing that can happen to him is that he says something is illegal. The president cannot do a thing, and the president does it anyway. And then the constitutional crisis is, now what? Right? The court has said it's illegal. The president did it anyway. I mean, who's going to do what? That's the crisis that they want to avoid. And J.D. Vance, in an interview, who may be a little bit more legally savvy than Trump is, has kind of expressed in somewhat more sophisticated terms. He said, "Look, you can say that what we're doing is unconstitutional up to a point, but if you're saying everything that we do is unconstitutional, then we're just going to say that you don't get the power to tell us what's constitutional or not." I mean, it was basically a pretty open threat to the courts to say, we will tolerate you overruling us up to a point, and then beyond that, we're just not going to listen to you anymore. And I'm fairly sure that that John Roberts was listening. And so there are some things that are slam dunks. I think the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship thing, it's very easy for them to say that the Trump administration is wrong on that one. And even if they were right, the mechanics of trying to, what are you going to do? Like tear up a bunch of birth certificates? It's very difficult to manage that. So I don't think the Trump administration even really wants that one to work. That was probably more of a distraction than anything else. So I think that there are a lot of cases where Trump is just going to lose. The easy ones, he's going to definitely lose. But there's just a lot of stuff out there. And if the court does say that it's all unconstitutional, then there is a high likelihood of defiance, which is what the court wants to avoid. So I expect that there will be a lot of dodges, actually. The second question, what was the second question?
The second question is rephrased quite well by Jamie Sherwood. So if the courts have to decide what's legal or constitutional, then how is there any power to enforce any of these rulings? So, the second part was any institutional guardrails or
Nothing. That's the
anything.
big trick of American government is that
right.
compliance with the courts has always been voluntary. I don't mean like the average citizen, right? The average, like if the court says, oh, well, you're not allowed to steal that car, and you steal the car, well, then somebody comes in, the police come after you. But the police are part of the executive, right? I mean, the state executive, the governor, or in the federal government, it's the president. And if the president himself, or if a governor in the state system wants to defy the courts, there's really nothing that the courts can do, right? There's no further recourse. I mean, they can scream that's illegitimate. And Jackson, when he allowed the Trail of Tears, right? There was in that ruling, the court said that the federal government had to enforce the law against the state of Georgia, and famously, I mean, it's not actually clear whether he actually said it, but famously, Jackson said, "Okay, Justice Marshall has made his ruling. Now let him come and enforce it," because basically the president is the one who enforces the law. So if the court is saying the president is wrong, the president is not just tasked with enforcing a thing, but is one of the parties to the dispute, and they rule against the president, who's going to enforce against the president? I mean, that's the whole truth. That is the delicate balance, is that our government is built on, the judicial system, the legal system is built on voluntary compliance by the executive. And that's why it's so dangerous.
Outside of, in a way, your area of study, the most effective recourse for the people?
That is a little bit outside of my area. I mean, outside of that, I mean, what the Constitution says is just vote. I mean, that's like the reason why the ultimate check on tyranny is that we kind of want we want Congress to push the limits and to try to use their power for to help people. We want the executive to push the limits. I mean, it's not like Trump is the first president to try to push the limits of his power. He's been doing it more extravagantly and in more interesting ways. But, there were every president. There were lots of things that Biden did that were probably unconstitutional. I don't think that there's inherently a problem with that. Presidents are supposed to push the limits of their power. It depends on in what way and to do what. But Biden tried to forgive all that student loan debt, right? I mean, that's unconstitutional. I don't think that was a constitutional crisis because there was no threat that if the court said it was unconstitutional, Biden wouldn't just comply. So that's not a constitutional crisis, but every president has done hundreds of things that are unconstitutional, and that's fine. They're supposed to test the limits, and the court's supposed to tell them where the limits are.
We have questions about the impeachment mechanism. Stephen says it's been used by both parties with seemingly little impact other than symbolic rebuke. Is there any legal power implicit in impeachment beyond the public rebuke, excuse me? And Joe Porter asking whether impeachment hearings can be held for defying court orders. Great question.
Yes, impeachment, defying court orders is something that they could be the basis for impeachment. The reason why, so Trump was in his first term impeached twice, well, Bill Clinton was also impeached. Right? The thing is that impeachment involves two steps. The impeachment itself, which is just like a super strong censure to say that no, but we don't approve of what you did, and that is pretty toothless. I mean, public perception matters, although it doesn't have any legal weight, it is something that the judges, courts, and the framers of the Constitution were very mindful of, and so even though it's just hortatory, that doesn't mean it's meaningless. But the teeth are after impeachment, the Senate also has the power to convict, and so. The conviction after impeachment would result in the removal from office. And that's why Nixon resigned, is because he knew that was coming, that they had the votes for it. And the reason why Clinton and Trump were impeached but not removed is because there were enough votes. There was a majority in the House to get the impeachment, but there wasn't the requisite 2/3 of the Senate to convict. And so, yeah, the thing is that the framers were concerned that the impeachment clause would be used to eliminate people for political reasons, and they didn't want to make it too easy. And so, to avoid it being like a political thing, like a partisan thing, they made it require a large, 2/3 majority. So that means that there has to be buy-in from most people. What the person did is really so bad that they have to be removed from office. In other words, people from your own party have to agree that you got to go. And so that's kind of the thought there.
That takes time, all these election cycles. And it takes time both to build up programs and to tear down programs or to switch programs. The challenge with executive orders, of course, versus going through Congress is that the next president can just undo the executive order. But when you've had major institutional reorganization, such as USAID, but any of the agencies, for example, that we're looking at, it's very hard to undo those. So on one hand, this is just a remark, the way our constitutional framework, our democratic framework is that change should take time. And yet there are some of these decisions that are just moving much more quickly, perhaps, than was envisioned.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there is a mismatch there. So the courts move very slowly. Congress moves slowly, not as slowly as the courts, but Congress moves slowly. And the president moves fast. And that's by design. I mean, the reason why the president is the commander in chief is because if you want quick action, and also the justification between the unitary executive is we want somebody who's responsive, who can do something tomorrow, the 3 a.m. phone call. That's the executive, the person who actually implements stuff. The person who makes the laws, they can be more contemplative and take their time. And of course, people who decide disputes, they take lots and lots of time. The problem is that if the other two branches are meant to be a check on the executive, what happens if the executive just moves really, really fast? I mean, speed matters, right? And so he can do quite a lot of stuff that may be unconstitutional, that maybe Congress or the courts would check, but they're just not fast enough to move to block him before he gets the things done. That hasn't really been an issue before. Arguably, maybe a little bit with FDR, but Trump hasn't been president. The second term hasn't kind of just started, and he's already done more than a lot of people do in a whole 2-year presidency or 2-term presidency. So we're realizing that there is actually kind of a structural problem here. I mean, whether you agree with what Trump is doing or not, whether you like it or not, there is a kind of a structural problem in that the pace of the branches is so different that if there's supposed to be checks on each other, that mismatch creates a problem and it favors the executive.
Boy, we could talk about this forever, and I think you've put forward the structure itself as well as the historical trends and current arguments in this fraught time really effectively. So thank you.
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that we wanted to bring up was the New Hampshire litigations around against the executive orders. And so, we talked about impact litigants and finding the best looking case. I think of the New Hampshire citizens and residents that are plaintiffs right now. We have in the birthright citizenship, an Indonesian couple with the mom to be in her third trimester. In the DEI in schools case, our plaintiffs are a high school English teacher, eighth grade social studies teacher, and a middle school counselor, all of them teachers in New Hampshire, and the families of two transgender girls in New Hampshire, originally challenging the state law and now expanding to challenge the executive order, barring state transgender girls from states nationwide, from sports nationwide. So whatever you feel about these particular cases, these are our neighbors who are going through this process in what may be a very public way, and is a enactment of our democracy. I'd like to ask you for any closing thoughts, and then I'll explain our next Carsey public policy.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're living in very interesting times. I mean, I think the last time we've had this much action on the extent of executive power was the Nixon administration. And this seems like it's going to be, the changes are more drastic, in part because Trump has a cooperative Congress and a cooperative court. Both other branches tend to be somewhat sympathetic to him. And so there's the potential that the law would change very significantly. It's something to pay a lot of attention to. I feel a little bit guilty taking my students' money when I teach constitutional law, because I feel like everything that I'm teaching them will most likely not be true by the time they graduate. We're in the midst of some really big change. In terms of how to think about it, the constitutionality of things, I think generally the takeaway message should be that we look to the Constitution to see where the president is getting his power and where the limitations are. And generally speaking, making that call is just the decision of the courts. And it's based on judicial philosophies like originalism or living constitutionalism. It's usually not political. People try to cast the judiciary as if it were a political branch of government, but the whole point of it is not to be. And so, although they are political, I think sometimes that gets a little bit overstated. I think, though, that we are in the midst of great change, and it is an interesting time to be observing the courts and American government. To the extent that if you don't like what's happening, then I think that the solution is really democratic change. Legally speaking, people are trying to put up as many roadblocks as they can, and there is a lot of friction. I mean, I don't think it's easy for Trump to get even with a compliant Congress and a compliant Supreme Court, it's still not easy for Trump to do the things that he's doing, and so much for the better, right? I mean, it's so much for the better if it would be a Democratic administration as well. We want the initiatives of an energetic executive to be tested constitutionally to the maximum extent possible, whatever he's trying to do, and that whatever he does ends up that we're sure that it is constitutional, that it is something that comports with this basic structure of our laws. So I guess let's keep watching. It's a very interesting time, and let's hope that the courts continue to hold the executive to account.
Thank you once again, Professor Payaya. You may see in the comments lots of calls for bring him back and more of this. So you're an audience favorite. I believe you were also voted graduation speaker for one of your university appointments, so I can see why. Thanks to everyone again for joining. Carsey Policy Hours are the second Wednesday of each month at 8 o'clock. On April 9th, we will hear from our very own Stephen Bird, director of the Carsey School and an energy policy scholar. The topic is something that I've been wondering about. I've heard many people wondering about next steps in U.S. and state energy portfolios. So how will these shifts in federal policy affect the composition of our national and state energy portfolios? Are solar and wind going to collapse without government incentives? What really are the factors that affect energy policy and markets, subsidies, tariffs, current actions at both the state and national level? So we'll look at current and past trajectories for different energy sources and discuss current concerns for energy affordability, security, sustainability, and the energy transition. So please do join us for that. Registration will be live later today if it's not already. And the next time we see you, we'll be celebrating Earth Day. So please do join us. Thank you again.